Welcome to the SOA Forum, a monthly debate series that features topics of special interest to libertarians and aims to enhance social and professional ties within New York City's libertarian community. We present the debates in partnership with Reason Magazine, and you can catch audio of all our events on Reason's YouTube channels. Thanks also to the Smith Family Foundation for making this series possible. I'm Gene Epstein, Economics and Books Editor at Barron's Financial Weekly, and the SOA Forum Director and Moderator. For more information and to buy tickets to our future debates, go to our website at thesoaforum.org. This is an Oxford-style debate in which the audience initially votes for, against, or undecided on the resolution, and then again after the debate is over. Whoever moves the vote in his or her favor is declared the winner. Tonight's resolution is as follows: all affirmative action programs in public colleges and universities that are based on ethnic, racial composition should be abolished. We are now closing the voting. Kate, close the voting. Defending the resolution, we have Yale law professor Peter Schuck, author of Why Government Fails So Often and One Nation Undecided. After the debate, Peter will be selling and signing both books in return for $20 bills. I have read both books, and I regard both books as fantastic gateway drugs to libertarianism for people with moderate leanings. So if you have a moderate friend and you want to give him a gateway drug so he'll start shooting up with the real libertarian hard stuff, buy him those books. $20 a piece, and Peter will sign each of them. They're a bargain at twice the price. Peter, please come to the stage. Arguing for the negative. Arguing for the negative, we have Michael Myers, president of the New York City Civil Rights Coalition. Michael, please come to the stage. Peter Schuck, you have 12 minutes to defend the resolution: all affirmative action programs in public colleges and universities that are based on ethnic, racial composition should be abolished. Take the podium.
Thank you, Gene, and thank you all for coming. My time is limited, so I'll get right to it. First, let me make clear what points I am not arguing. I am not disputing that the legacy of slavery still exists, though it's more tenuous now 150 years after emancipation, nor am I disputing the fact that society has a moral obligation to do what it can to rectify this gross injustice, if it will in fact rectify it. The constitutionality of race-based affirmative action is not an issue with me. Unlike most affirmative action opponents, I believe that it is constitutional. I can explain why if you're interested. Third, the definition of merit is not at issue here. It can be defined in many ways, and private institutions should have latitude in how to define it. Fourth, the dearth of black students in top-tier institutions is very striking. Only 4% in the top decile of the four-year institutions are black. 26% of the lowest decile of institutions are black. Whether this is underrepresentation depends on the reasons why it persists despite strenuous efforts to overcome it. Next, I am not arguing that affirmative action in private institutions is wrong. My argument focuses on public institutions which have special responsibilities to treat all people equally. Private institutions are different, and not just for constitutional reasons. And then finally, I am not arguing about workplaces or housing. I'm talking about public education and colleges and universities. Although some of the same arguments apply to other sectors' activity. So that's what I'm not arguing. What I am arguing is, first, race-based affirmative action is a poor public policy. It is not wise. Its social costs exceed its social benefits. It harms the very people, certain racial minorities, that it is intended to protect. It is not responsible for tense race relations, but it contributes to it out of all proportion to the relatively small number of people it affects. Most people, by the way, say that affirmative action doesn't affect them at all. I speculate that it helped to elect Donald Trump, which in my view is cause enough to oppose it, but that's not my only reason. Of course, many other factors were at play. Affirmative action for women is much more popular than for racial minorities. I'm arguing that it does not help even those minorities, particularly blacks, whom it favors. In fact, it favors immigrants and relatively privileged blacks, not the ones who we imagine would benefit from affirmative action. It discriminates against other minorities, principally Asians and lower and working class whites. If I were a college president, I personally would oppose athletic and legacy preferences, but private institutions can legitimately decide whom to admit to their communities and on what basis. A second proposition that I am arguing is about racial classifications. They are the technocratic basis of affirmative action, and they are increasingly meaningless, misleading, and manipulated. Let me just briefly explain why I believe that. A significant growing number of Americans, almost 7%, according to a Pew Center report, more than triple the Census Bureau estimates, are ethnic hybrids, falling into two or more of those categories, with the largest such group, half the total, being a mix of whites and Native Americans. An estimated 26% of Hispanics and 28% of Asian Americans marry a spouse of a different race or ethnicity. I'm going to emphasize two key distinctions. One is between equality of opportunity on the one hand and equality of outcome involving picking and choosing on the other. And secondly, I'm distinguishing between affirmative action in principle, which could include greater outreach and greater financial aid, which I favor, versus preferences in fact. This distinction between affirmative action in principle and preferences in fact is emphasized by all groups who have considered the merits of this policy. Another point is that public attitudes toward affirmative action are extremely negative. In 2013, the Gallup poll found that 67% of all adults, 59% of Hispanics, and 44% of blacks agree that, quote, applicants should be admitted solely on the basis of merit, even if this results in fewer minorities being admitted. Only 28% of all adults, 31% of Hispanics, and 48% of blacks agree that an applicant's racial and ethnic background should be considered to help promote diversity on campuses, even if that means admitting some minority students who otherwise would not be admitted. So that's only 28% of the population, and even a minority of blacks. In 2016, after the Supreme Court decided the Fisher II case, which upheld Texas's affirmative action program, the public was even more opposed to preferences than in 2013 when those other polls that I cited were conducted. 63% of blacks disagreed with the Supreme Court's decision upholding affirmative action, which was only slightly below whites' 66% disapproval rate. Another important finding by social scientists is that the opposition to preferences is based mainly on principle. And I want to read a brief excerpt from the leading study on this question. I'll introduce the quote. A 1997 analysis by political scientists Paul Snyderman and Edward Carmines, who employed a variety of survey-based experiments in order to tease out public attitudes in a more nuanced way, found, 1, the role of racial prejudice in promoting opposition to affirmative action is minor. 2, rather than opposition to affirmative action signaling a refusal to acknowledge the discrimination and exploitation that black Americans have suffered, a substantial majority of white Americans believe that an extra effort should be made to see that blacks are treated fairly. 3, opposition to affirmative action is not peculiar to Americans. 4, opposition to affirmative action does not hinge on the race of the group that benefits, but rather on whether the procedures involved are judged to be fair. 5, in addition to dislike of blacks leading to dislike of affirmative action fosters dislike of blacks. 6, opposition to and resentment over affirmative action has burst conventional political channels. It is now as prevalent on the left among liberals and Democrats as it is on the right among conservatives and Republicans. Another point that I emphasize is the size of preferences is huge. It's not modest. And here again, I want to read briefly from summarizing this point. Writing in 2009, researchers Thomas Espenshade and Alexandra Radford reported that the admission bonus for being black was equivalent to 310 SAT points relative to whites and even more relative to Asians. The GPA differences are even greater than for SAT scores. Another researcher, Thomas Kane, found that black applicants to selective schools enjoy an advantage equivalent to an increase of 2/3 of a point in GPA on a 4-point scale, or the equivalent of 400 points on the SAT. So it's not just a tiebreaker. It's not modest. Another important reason for my opposition is the phenomenon of mismatch. As one analyst has put it, the main victims of large preferences are not the whites and Asians who get passed over, but the many blacks and Hispanics who receive preferences and do badly at their schools. This leads to stereotypes and stigmatization of a very real and pernicious kind. Just let me find it, I'm sorry. By admitting minority students with academic records that are much weaker, whatever the school's metric, than those of their competitors, the school can only reinforce the stereotype of academic inferiority. The faculty and non-preferred students notice what is going on and draw the logical and stigmatizing inference that the preferred group's academic abilities are inferior. This inference often takes the form of insidious innuendo about the deserts of almost all but the most unquestionably superior performers in the preferred group. This innuendo tends to perpetuate the very stereotypes that affirmative action is supposed to dispel. Another important reason is that any moral obligation we owe is to the descendants of enslaved blacks, not to immigrants. Yet 75% of those eligible for affirmative action are immigrants. Then there's the diversity rationale for affirmative action. That leads to a whole set of questions that I discuss in the chapter in my book from which I'm departing. The question of what is diversity value in the college setting, and at which level large classrooms, seminars, majors, dorms, would diversity enhance the quality of academic life? Why race rather than partisanship or religious affiliation? Doesn't the perspective of white Muslims or fundamental Christians have at least as much diversity value as middle-class blacks or Hispanics? Also, the diversity value of affirmative action depends on assumptions about essentialism. That blacks are essentially the same in important respects, which we know is not the case. Okay, then there's the point about self-isolation, which I could talk about later. There's an Air Force Academy study which shows that minority students who benefit from affirmative action tend to isolate themselves from others. And finally, there are race-neutral alternatives, and I can discuss that later on. Thank you.
Michael Myers, 12 minutes.
I'm Michael Myers. I'm the president and executive director of the New York Civil Rights Coalition and civil libertarian, and former assistant national director for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Let me address straight away the question that is not always honestly or knowledgeably discussed in the debate about affirmative action, the question of qualifications. Not at issue today is the long history associated with the exclusion of women from academic institutions, as was the case with a now deceased friend of mine, a black libertarian woman who was admitted to an all-male college on the belief that she was a man because her parents had given her a man's name. Black and female, her qualifications were not at issue. But a lawsuit was threatened to compel her admission. There was no subterfuge on her part, just a mistake by the admissions. Admissions officers make mistakes. Recently, University of California, Irvine rescinded admissions offers to some 500, exactly 499, incoming students faced with over-enrollment, all qualified. UC Irvine got 104,000 applications, admitted 7,100, too many, oops. And this summer, Harvard College, all very qualified students, rescinded admissions offers to 10 students after discovering their Facebook posts that were sexually explicit, obscene, racially offensive, that mocked the Holocaust and racial minorities. The group self-identified themselves as Harvard memes for horny bourgeois teens. Exclusion used to be black and white. When Herm Sweat, a qualified black man, applied to the all-white University of Texas Law School, the guardians of the academy rejected him because he was black. The school was hit with a lawsuit claiming a violation, yes, of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution, the Equal Protection Clause. And the state's response to the lawsuit, they wanted, under the doctrine of separate but equal, they delayed the decision and opened an entire law school for one student, the black man. The law school had one student, 2 faculty members, and 2 rooms. The United States Supreme Court, in its 1950 ruling, forced the admission of Mr. Sweat, and also another black, George Washington Jr., another black applicant, to the University of Texas Law School. In a nutshell, the highest court of the land intervened to reverse the exclusion of qualified black students to the state's all-white law school, citing the 14th Amendment. The barriers to equal opportunity, equal treatment, equal access to the mainstream institutions did not go away at the behest of the guardians of the academy, however. They who erected and explained and fortified their justifications for the racial status quo, for racial exclusion. Now, they did not comply with the later Brown decision. No blacks, however qualified, were regarded as qualified as any white applicants. Good faith compliance with Brown never came about. But that was the edict of the Brown decision, to transform the exclusionary public colleges and universities into equal opportunity institutions. As my mentor, Kenneth Clark, put it, those who were the traditional beneficiaries of the limited democratization of higher education themselves became intense adversaries and agents of exclusion of the qualified based solely on their race. Every effort of reversing affirmative action preferences for whites was resisted and opposed by those who regarded themselves as most qualified. Indeed, as better qualified than recent admittees to the then lily white colleges and universities, even as they regard themselves as personally, individually innocent of racial prejudice and discriminatory purpose. Innocent. In 1973, one example, Alan Bakke, on the advice of legal counsel, thought himself as aggrieved and as a victim of reverse discrimination. Even after 12 medical schools, some medical schools that didn't admit any blacks, after 12 medical schools had rejected his admission, Bakke zeroed on the UC Davis, University of California Davis Medical School, because he was directed from the inside of the University of California Davis Medical School to challenge the school's special admissions programs for ethno-racial minorities. The then new medical school had opened in 1968 with an all-white inaugural class. The faculty, according to the record, in the years Bakke had applied, had set aside 16 of 100 seats for special attention and consideration of its special admissions committee. Bakke, a Marine vet, an engineer already, and already in his mid-30s, he decided to change careers, and he wanted to become a doctor. So he went to apply to medical school, 12, and got rejected by all 12. He would not take no for an answer. The insider, an assistant dean of admissions, answered his plea. Is there any way that I can get into that medical school? Any way whatsoever? The assistant dean of the admissions at the medical schools answered him and said, oh, yeah, you know, we have this special program. Set aside 16 seats. And you ought to go and talk to these particular lawyers, 2 lawyers that the insider gave to the applicant who was rejected by the medical school twice. Not everyone agrees then or agrees now on the extent, the pervasiveness, and the tenacity of racial exclusion that placed blacks behind the 8 ball of segregation, much less on the compelling reasons, the compelling interest of the state to reverse the discrimination, the wholesale segregation of people based on their skin color. Blacks were quoted out, and blacks don't have any objections in terms of racial integration to be quoted in. Those who argued that blacks had been quoted out of the mainstream colleges and universities and kept out of the professional schools felt no stigma or need to object to being quoted in. The quota of 0 was offensive. The temerity of tokenism was the badge of inferiority and offensive to the racial minorities who were excluded because, not of because of their qualifications or lack of qualifications, but because of their skin color. There were no objections from blacks or the civil rights movement community to set aside for women. When all male institutions decided to become co-ed, there was no reasonable opposition to setting quotas for athletes, or for geographical diversity, or for the inclusion of legacies and the friends and children of major donors, without regard, by the way, to their qualifications. At that same medical school I told you about, and which I don't have time now to further expound on, that same medical school, they had special admissions, 5 every year, by the dean of the school, for the special friends of donors, and of course, one who was a relative of a state assemblyman who didn't even form or submit an application and got admitted. Come on. Come on. You talk about qualifications. I know of no court decision, none, that reversed the admission of any minority student wherein a court substituted its judgment about qualifications in this domain of academic life for the judgment of the admissions officials of the academy. They are the ones who decide who's qualified. They are the ones who are the guardians of the academy, and they are the ones who admit, who decide who's fit, who's better qualified, who's not as qualified, who pick and choose among the many qualified. They are the ones who have an academic freedom issue and interest in composing their class. Not you, not any of us.
Thank you, Michael. Five minutes of rebuttal. Peter.
Thank you. Well, I'm in the unusual position for a debater of agreeing with almost everything Michael said. So I will touch on a few points that he made, and I concede that what you said is true. I do not concede that they're relevant to the merits and demerits of affirmative action. So Michael emphasized that admission officers make mistakes. Well, of course they do. And the question is there any remedy for admissions officers making mistakes except better training and clearer rules and so forth? I don't think there is, and that has absolutely nothing to do with affirmative action, either pro or con. Secondly, he emphasizes the history of racism and separate but equal in America, and I couldn't agree more with his account. Again, it creates a moral obligation on all of us to try to avoid that in the present and to remedy that sordid past today, if we can do so without making the situation even worse. And that's a very important qualification that I mentioned earlier. A third point he made is that the barriers of equal opportunity did not end with Brown versus Board, that resistance continued, and that in the old days, there was, in that sense, a kind of affirmative action for whites. And of course, if I or anybody in this hall agreed with the racism that was responsible for that terrible history of injustice, that would be relevant, but we don't. And so again, the question is, what about affirmative action today? What are its effects? And that is something that Michael hasn't addressed at all. And then a fourth point he made is that the state is obliged to remedy discrimination. Again, I completely agree with him. But there is a key distinction between anti-discrimination, the anti-discrimination principle on the one hand, which I strongly endorse, as I suspect everybody in this room does, and racial preferences, which I oppose. Let me read an important analysis of this from my book, so I think it's important. Affirmative action or preferences, I use the terms interchangeably, and for good reason. They are the same in practice, is not mandated by federal law, except for federal contractors. Most states don't require it, and some even prohibit it. Indeed, the fact that different states and perhaps different institutions within those states take their approaches to affirmative action take their own approaches to affirmative action is a great strength, reflecting the nation's diverse attitudes about it. I distinguish affirmative action from non-discrimination, a more passive practice in which the normative principle is simply to refrain from treating people differently on the basis of their ethno-racial characteristics. The distinction between affirmative action and non-discrimination is clear and important, both in politics and in principle, though not always in practice. Non-discrimination, in sharp contrast to affirmative action, is no longer controversial in American society, except among bigots and some libertarians, present company not included. Public discourse severely condemns any hint of anti-black or anti-minority attitudes, and rightly associates non-discrimination with the universally praised norm of equal opportunity, while generally disparaging preferences as a demand for equal outcomes or special treatment. Some strong egalitarians favor affirmative action precisely because they think that it will equalize results. But most affirmative action proponents make a much more limited argument, that it is essential for genuine equal opportunity. Both proponents and opponents of affirmative action define non-discrimination in ways that they hope will exploit the greater legitimacy of non-discrimination. And I explain, I elaborate on this distinction. Again, my claim is that we are committed and ought to be committed and fully implement that commitment to non-discrimination, and I favor extraordinarily strong remedies for doing that. But affirmative action preferences, which give advantages in an application process to people based on their skin color or their surnames, is an altogether different proposition, which has none of the moral legitimacy and of non-discrimination, and has very negative effects, as I've endeavored to suggest.
Thank you, Peter. Michael, 5 minutes for Breno.
Let me say what Peter did not address. Peter did not address or discuss the harmful effects of segregation, racial prejudice, racial preferences that has been practiced for decades, if not centuries. He did not address the damaging effects of that segregation, of that harm, on majority students who become arrogant, who think they're better than people, because nobody could come into the university or the college under a special admissions program unless they were unqualified or underqualified or differently qualified. So there is an impact on the white majority, at least then the white majority. It's not a tiebreaker. It's a judgment. Now, I want to address something that Peter kind of inadvertently tried to get to about racial colorblindness. I want to correct the misstatement of facts and the civil rights and race history that the opponents of affirmative action often make. They cite Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as an advocate of colorblindness. Dr. King was neither naive nor ignorant of the effects of long-term racial discrimination against blacks, which had the effect of creating, today, a dual American society, one black, one white, and unequal. How whites benefited from built-in advantages and institutional biases and preference. Looking at our racially polarized society, Dr. King called for action, not just good faith, action on the integration front, saying there is always a right time to do the right thing. Well, we're running out of time. We're running out of time. You know, Sandra Day O'Connell talked about 25 years. Oh, 25 years was an imagination. 25 more years we need. We won't be through with it. We'll have elected a black president or a half-black, half-white president. No. There is never an inappropriate time to do moral justice, to rectify the past wrongs that have been done to a people because of their skin color. Now, you can pretend, and that's just what it is, a pretense, that everybody is not a racist. Everybody who says they are opposed to affirmative action and reverse discrimination, everybody who's opposed, that people are innocent. Personally innocent. They don't have any racial feelings, racist feelings. They don't mean to discriminate or exclude. They just prefer that there be, quote unquote, merit. Well, who said there is no merit? Except those who oppose affirmative action. All the guardians of the academy say, we have made qualitative decisions about our class. You didn't get in, but that would mean that you were better qualified than the people who did get in. Now, as far as this GPA score, gap, and all that other nonsense, that's what it is, statistical baloney. Statistical baloney. I've heard and read for so many years, but well, you know, theoretically and statistically, blacks doesn't matter. They don't have the intellect of white people. We should call that, in the day, scientific racism. As they say, liars know how to figure, and figures often lie through exaggeration, through privilege, through prejudicial attitudes about the data. So I am not a person who says because you got 5 points more or you got 100 points more on your SAT scores that predict only the first year of college success, that you can't be successful. I go with the judgment of the qualified people who are the guardians of the academy, who are in the admissions office. I served in the admissions committee in my college. I served in the admissions committee in my law school. I looked at the folders. I know how to make the judgments. And I see the differences that people who are not knowledgeable about a single folder, who have not even looked at a single applicant, I know more, as do the admissions officers know. So don't give me this crap, and that's what it is, crap, that the people that we admit are underqualified.
Thank you, Michael. We now go to the next phase of our debate. We'll think about the questions you may want to ask the debaters, but each of them has a right to ask the other a question, 2 questions apiece. Peter, do you have a question you want to ask Michael? No.
First, let me, before I do that, what's your question?
It's fine, it's on.
Okay. First, let me clarify a statement that Michael made that is just wrong. I did address the gross injustices in past discrimination, and
okay, you did address them, but you want to ask? You maybe want to ask that in terms of a question.
Okay. First question: why do you think blacks and Hispanics, the so-called beneficiaries of affirmative action preferences, oppose those preferences, as distinguished from non-discrimination, which they and we all applaud?
That's what you say, and that's your data, and that's your survey. The blacks I know, and the surveys I've read, blacks do not oppose affirmative action. They just don't. But even if they did, so what? Now, with respect to those who have been privileged and who have been preferred, blacks have been opposed to tokenism and exclusion from these academies. They certainly are opposed to that. So, but they don't want people to get the impression that they are being let in and being done a favor. Blacks don't accept that. And they don't like the stereotype, they don't like the stigma, and that's what they're saying in those surveys that you mentioned.
Michael, you have a question for Peter?
Yes, I do. Let's assume, for purposes of argument's sake, that a public college, university, or professional school, in making decisions at the admissions office, and they don't have sufficient, in their judgment, not yours, their judgment, racial or ethnic diversity. The class is all white, or the class is all Asian. Do you, and there are candidates who have equal qualifications in their judgment, not yours. Do you think in order to achieve diversity and to overcome past discrimination that the college officials or admissions officials have a right to say, this is a tiebreaker, and we're gonna put our finger on the persons who are not in the class so we can have diversity?
Did you understand the question?
You got the question?
You posited two facts that are not true.
It's not a question of truth. It's a hypothetical question.
Okay,
Hypothetical.
you posed a hypothetical question that is premised on two conditions that are not true. The first is that the institution is all white, which is not
I didn't say that. The class. The class.
The class is all white. Same thing. It's not true. It's not true in any institution in the United States. And secondly, that they have equal qualifications. Now, they do not have equal qualifications as measured by the standard criteria for academic performance. In fact,
you're missing the question. I said in their judgment, not yours. In their judgment. Answer the question.
In their judgment, there are equal qualifications?
Yeah, in their judgment, they have candidates who have equal qualifications, and the admission of a class that is not diverse in the way they want it to be. Can they put their finger on the candidate who achieves for the institution, for that class, racial or ethnic diversity? That's the question.
Well, in my account of diversity, which I go into extensively in this book and in other writings, that is not true diversity. What is true diversity is diversity based on points of view, of a background, and so forth. And that is not well measured by race. It is much better measured actually by political attitudes, and by actually religious worldviews.
Please, you'll show.
I do not believe that all blacks are the same, and that merely by virtue of being black.
That's not answering my question.
Well, I'm explaining why any diversity program ought to focus on those things about which people really differ, not the color of their skin.
The audience will judge whether or not Peter ducked the question. Please, no screaming. You'll just show how you feel through your voting. No displays of emotion from the audience. Thank you. Peter, do you have a question for Michael? Your second question.
Yes. Why does he think the GPA and SAT scores are baloney? In fact, SAT scores overpredict the academic performance of blacks in colleges and universities. Why are they baloney? And if they're baloney, why do you suppose every university depends upon them in order to remember that these tests were designed to prevent discrimination by putting everybody on an equal playing field insofar as academic potential and performance were concerned, the SAT and GPA scores. So why do you think that they're baloney, and if so, why do you think that every academic institution relies heavily on them?
What I said was it's the statistical baloney. That's what I said. And so if you're going to quote me correctly. Now, with respect to the GPA scores, SAT scores, this is a broad spectrum of qualifications. It's not as narrow as you would have it. So people look at GPA scores. When you're in the admissions office, we look at GPA scores. We look at the final year one's high school. Were your grades good? Did you fall down? If you fell down, why? And why should we be concerned? We look at SAT scores. We look at references. We look at job experience. We look at internships. We look at people who do all this extracurricular work. They're not doing extracurricular work for naught. They want to have the advantage at the admissions office, saying, I'm a broader person. I'm not a narrow person. I'm a broader person. I do community service. I work for the student government. I'm civics oriented. So these are broad categories. That's why I say when you zero in on this GPA, the GPA, you fell down your senior year.
Okay, you've answered the question, Michael. Do you have a question to put to Peter?
Well,
Do you have a question?
let me comment on that last point.
You interrupt me, but not him.
Yeah,
no,
Peter.
you can't comment on that. That's my question. My questions are next.
Okay, go ahead, Michael.
Yeah,
Yes.
thank you. Let's keep the rules.
Give the question.
Okay, now, there's no more preferences. Now, my question to you is, let's take, for an example, I'll give another hypothetical. Hypothetical, but that's realistic. Let's say that some university, college in University of California, they see that through the admissions process, and California is a very diverse population, but all these very qualified Asian students are coming in and out of the university and being admitted, and oh my Lord, somebody says, well, don't we want Hispanics? Don't we want blacks? Is the class going to be 70% Asian? I understand that at places like Stuyvesant High School because it's one test. But my question to you is, what if it was found that a public university intentionally decided not to admit as many qualified Asian students as there were at the gate? And would they have a right to sue, a right for a numerical remedy because of their racial and ethnic exclusion?
You got the question? They're discriminating against Asians. Will the Asians have a right to sue? That's your question? Okay, yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Yes, I think they do have a right to sue. I think they do have a right to sue, and in fact, they are suing. They're suing Harvard and perhaps some other institutions as well, and I think they have a very good case. And there is simply no reason to believe, and lots of reasons not to believe, that Asians are not as well qualified as black students are with respect to these non-academic aspects of the record that you emphasize, in terms of community service, in terms of working hard, extracurricular activities, and what have you. There is simply no reason to believe that that's the case. So it's purely on the basis of race, and any candid university official would admit that that's the case.
Line up for questions. As you're lining up, I want to take moderator's prerogative to ask a question of each of the debaters, but please line up in front of the mic for your questions. My question to you, Peter, is you mentioned that you don't like the fact that a lot of blacks who take advantage of the racial preferences that are synonymous with affirmative action, you don't like the fact that many of them are not descended from slaves. Would you allow a new form of racial preference in which, if it's possible to show through your lineage that you are indeed descended from slaves, let's say 90%, if you are a descendant from slaves, would you then, as the descendant from slaves, be allowed, in your view, to exercise the advantages of affirmative action? Would you allow that in that case? Why, no, and why not?
Because I believe that it's a very bad policy for all the reasons I expressed, of which the immigration aspect was only one throwaway. I believe for lots of reasons that this is a very bad policy that actually injures rather than enhances the future prospects of blacks in our society. It may help a few of the blacks who are affirmative action beneficiaries on college campuses, but it also wounds many of them through the stigmatization and stereotypical formation that affirmative action encourages.
Michael, my question for you is the following. It's not hypothetical but factual that in the elite schools where blacks are admitted with lower GPA scores and with lower SAT scores, that their dropout and failure rate is higher than that of people who are admitted with higher GPA. Now, so then we're not talking about the baloney of the scores. We're talking about the actual fact that many more of them flunk out and fail. And if that is the case, and if you're running such a university, people are being admitted with, and these scores turn out to be predictions that more of them will flunk out, and you find that they are flunking out, fact rather than baloney. Would that bother you if you were running such an institution, and would you think in terms of reversing the policies of that institution?
That sounds like one of those colored questions. Let me put it this way. I really am bored by this argument. I really am. I'm bored by it.
Okay.
Because
boredom aside, could you answer the question?
I'm going to answer the question. My answer, my question, your question is to ask some questions. Yeah. What is it about the individual students who have dropped out, who have not graduated, blah, 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 that will inform me and inform the admissions officers about their academic experience? For example, Mr. Sweat, who got admitted to law school, was admitted to the law school. He's black. George Washington Jr., who's black, got admitted to the same law school, forced in by the court decision. Sweat did not graduate from law school. And there were people who wanted to know why. He was interested, he was qualified, he wanted to graduate, but we found out in terms of individual circumstances, family circumstances, his health, blah, 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 it goes on and on and on. Now, George Washington Jr., the other black, he succeeded, he got through, he did quite well in law school. So I can't make judgments about people based on their skin color and make the quick equation that, well, they didn't do so well and they dropped out and it's only because of the admissions decision. No, that's not the case. You have to look at the individual. No. I'm tired of people looking at people by their skin color to make judgments about their personality, about their achievement, about their abilities.
The idea is not skin color, but that GPA.
Are you debating or what?
No, I just want to repeat the question. The question is that GPA and test scores predict success or failure in school, and that there seems to be a correlation between that.
No. Okay. My reading of the research is that those things predict success, at least in the first year. Now, that doesn't say those things are exact science. And because people have different life experiences, and not because they're black, by the way. So there, I agree with you. Not because they're black. But they have different life experiences. They have different pressures. They got jobs, or they don't have jobs. They have health problems, whatever it is. They have different experiences as an individual. I would not take problems of a segment of people in the college and say, well, you dropped out because you weren't really qualified to get in here. The admissions officers said, you were qualified. Now, what happens at college is another thing, because there's lots of paternalistic, yes, racist programs in college and in professional schools where the colleges continue to treat the black students not as individuals, but as groups, as at risk. Special admissions, special orientation. Now, that's not integration. They demean them, they stereotype them, they think they are inferior, and they treat them like that in college. That's what some of the Black Lives Matter students are complaining about.
Thank you, Michael. Keep your microphone crispy. You may have a question. Okay, first, again, please ask your question. Ask a question. Take it away, sir.
Thank you. Well, Gene, first of all, congrats. Another lively, good debate. I just have a general question about methods. Whatever methods are used to determine whether affirmative or comparable programs are needed or not needed, surveys, studies, statistical analysis, and what have you, I wonder how often those methods are revisited. I think sometimes the interactions between people are more sophisticated than the methods used to study. So I'm just wondering, you guys are intellectuals, you probably revisit it a lot and it's evolving. So I'm just wondering how often you go and check and see that there are more efficacious outcomes with, are these things needed or are they not needed? As Peter said, are the costs, do they exceed the benefits and what have you?
Michael, you can answer the question. Look at that, Peter.
Excellent.
Can I give you the last word on that? Let Peter answer the question first. You want to address that question at all?
Sure. Well, when one writes a book, as I have, about this on this subject, or at least one chapter is about it, that's exactly what one does. One looks at the best evidence that exists, the most current evidence that exists, the kinds of studies that compare before and after, the kinds of studies that compare different forms of intervention, and then derive one's conclusions from that. So that's exactly what a good social scientist does. And in this book, I have brought together what I view as the best social science on the particular subjects.
Michael.
I think it's an excellent question because it goes to the heart of what I was beginning to say about programs. Colleges very often admit people, not based on race, but based on differences. And they will admit people, for example, athletes or others, who are not as academically qualified as the quote-unquote regular admittee. And they develop programs, special programs, remedial programs. And some people are good at math and some people are not. Some people are excellent in linguistics, but not at math. And sometimes the college will have diagnostic tests when you come in and say, well, this person needs a little remediation. Not based on race, but based on test scores or the test they give you once you get to campus. Now, I think people keep doing this in terms of revising and looking at the programs they offer. But too often, the guardians of the academy don't do that. Too often, the guardians of the academy, they figure, they already know that because of your skin color, because of where you come from the ghetto, you come from the urban areas, because of that, you need special treatment. You need a special orientation program, you need black counselors, you need this, you need that. That is paternalism. That is racism. And that's why I argue for individual assessment. And the colleges ought to have individual assessments. And if they don't have that, then the Board of Trustees should have individual assessments of the college president and the officers who have engaged in what I consider to be a failure of the human intellect. Because they're supposed to be the best and the brightest, and they're not.
Thank you, Michael. Next question.
Yes.
Well, we should plan when the question comes. The next question.
Yes. Question. Yes. Question for Dr. Schuck. You mentioned that you considered that the Asian students had a right to sue Harvard for, I don't know whether you'll call it affirmative action against them or discrimination. Regarding Harvard as a private institution, how does that relate to this argument, which was about public institutions? And regarding the fact that Harvard receives enormous public funding, how does that affect your response?
Okay, well, that's a very good question. The answer is very, very simple, however, which is that Harvard accepts a lot of public funding, as you just mentioned, and that makes them subject to the civil rights laws. And so if they discriminate on the basis of race, as I believe they have, and excluding Asians in this way, then they are subject to sanction under the civil rights laws.
Did you want to comment on something Michael said?
Well, can I answer the question? Yeah. Well, that's basically correct in terms of response. But the question is whether if a college has an academic freedom interest, private or public, an academic freedom interest in ensuring that there's no overrepresentation of any particular racial or ethnic group. Now, that's not exclusion if you're overrepresented. So the question is, can the college or the university, the professional school or the undergraduate school, public or private, can they see certain patterns? Can they see certain issues? And you have a very qualified pool. Can they put a finger to achieve diversity? And there's nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that. So the Asian students that you call them, Asian students in quotes, they can sue, but they ain't gonna win.
Next question.
Hello, thank you for this debate. My question is specifically for Mr. Myers, and of course, if you would like to respond as well. But affirmative action sets up quotas that colleges are required by law to meet. These colleges reject not only whites, but other minorities who are qualified in order to meet these quotas. If the goal is to move towards a more diverse and accepting nation, do you feel like this accomplishment of meeting quotas really helps to promote true diversity and allow for and lead to a society where we no longer need these social checks?
I think I heard the question, and the question was for me.
Summarize the question. I had trouble
She
understanding.
talked about the issue of quotas, and do they, in effect, discriminate against people otherwise qualified for admission? I think the short answer to your question is, I don't have any problem with including people based on a quota, as long as it's not tokenism. And now, the courts have a problem with quotas, and we don't need to go into all the history about that. Now, the courts have a problem with quotas, except where there is evidence and a showing of purposeful, extensive, intentional discrimination based on that particular group's skin color, for example. Now, the courts can and will remedy that kind of exclusion or discrimination based on sometimes a racial quota. I mean, for example, the construction industry was a long time discriminating against blacks. They didn't admit blacks in the unions. They hated blacks. You know, they just didn't want them in there. And so, you know, when you have an anti-black policy and pattern and practice, you have the courts that can say, well, no, you have admitted all these white people. Now, from now on, there's going to be one here, one black, and one white, or one this and one that. The courts do that all the time when there's a showing of intentional discrimination. So, but I don't have any problem personally with quotas, as long as they're inclusionary and not stigmatizing in the sense of, well, we only admit one of you.
Okay, Peter, have a comment?
Well, yes, quotas are exclusionary. By definition, they're exclusionary. They're exclusionary of those people who do not qualify for the quotas, for that special dispensation. So that's one point. The second point is that listening to Michael speak, the colleges and universities are really in a catch-22 situation. If they admit lower performing students or those with lower academic credentials, and then they try to help them through remedial programs and posse type programs to help them get socialized to what is often an unfamiliar environment, and all sorts of other efforts, they're racist. Michael has said that's racist. It's not racist. It may be misguided or may be wise, but it's not racist. It's an effort to deal with the real problem that affirmative action obscures, which is that black applicants to these schools are, by and large, on a statistical basis, there are lots of exceptions, but by and large, they are less well qualified to succeed at university than Asians and whites with the same opportunities. So I think that really places the universities in an impossible position.
You want to make a comment?
Sorry, just like a slight clarification. Sorry for the wordiness. But do you feel like through affirmative action, we are reaching the goals that we set out to reach?
Well, I don't know what you mean by goals. That depends on the institution, and it goes back to each institution has its own policy, affirmative action policy, if they have an affirmative action policy. They have to determine whether or not through recruitment, through success in recruitment, through applications, through diversity of the pool, whether or not they're meeting their goals, and through the admission of students. I mean, it's, for example, when Columbia was all male, Columbia decided to become co-ed. And I think the admissions office has had to make a determination with the advice and counsel and the guidance of the administrative leadership, well, how many women do we want in our class? I mean, that's a legitimate quota. That's a legitimate goal. 50-50. If we can do it from qualified applicants, let's go 50-50, because we're now a co-ed institution. Now, with respect to this issue about this nonsense, really, about there are, with some exceptions, well, they're all blacks who are so qualified, and therefore, Peter doesn't want to address them because they're qualified, and they're qualified blacks. But, you know, the problem is that too many of these institutions, this is what I said about racism. I said when every black who gets into a college or a university or a professional school, regardless of the means they get in, let's say they come from the best private schools, or they don't come from ghettos. Let's say they come from suburbia. Their parents are Barack Obama or somebody, and Michelle Obama. I'm not going to send the children of Barack Obama and Michelle Obama to a special remediation program because of their skin color. That's racism. That's paternalism, which is a form of racism. You can't treat all black students alike because of their skin color.
Next
you just
question.
can't do it.
Thank you, Michael. Next question.
All right, so I have kind of the same question for both of you guys. I think everyone has the same goal of having as little discrimination in our society as possible. So I'm guessing for Peter, you would say that our discrimination is already low enough that we don't need affirmative action. So do you think that at any point it was beneficial? And for Mr. Myers, I'm guessing you would think that we do still need it. So in your opinion, do you think there's any point in the future you can see where we won't need it? And what would your criteria be for deciding at what point we don't need it anymore?
Peter, take your hand.
I'd say you've got it exactly wrong. I believe that affirmative action is, or at least preferences, are discriminatory. And that's bad regardless of how society has progressed or not progressed. So I think, yes, there's plenty of discrimination in society. We're talking about a particular type of discrimination with regard to admissions to relatively elite institutions. And if preferences are discriminatory, as they exclude others simply on the basis of race, then they are unjust, just as Jewish quotas were unjust 50 years ago, and other exclusions based on characteristics that people can't control are unjust.
Michael?
Well, I was the affirmative action officer for the American Civil Liberties Union. And when I got in there, oh my God, the American Civil Liberties Union. I know we're on video, but there was a history of exclusion based on race. And to the board's credit, the board of directors, albeit with my hounding, to the board's credit, they recognized there was discrimination and exclusion based on gender and race, and they developed a plan, a program, an affirmative action program to do something about that, to eradicate the de minimis numbers of racial minorities and women on the board of directors and on the staff. In due course, because of good faith, because of enforcement of the policy, because of people being tough and serious about the policy and recruitment, all the time, never lowering qualifications for either board or staff, never, never, never. Because of that serious attention to process, to goals, achievement, I resigned as affirmative action officer once those goals were accomplished and achieved. So my answer to you is that each institution that has an affirmative action process or a history of discrimination and exclusion or tokenism, each institution has to come to the realization of what is needed at that college by way of goals and timetables. And I can't, as an outsider, say, well, you got to have this and you got to have that. I mean, some colleges and professional schools felt the same way about their faculty. And I'm delighted to see so many qualified minority professors. But there was a time in my lifetime when the courtrooms were lily white. The juries were lily white. The lawyers were lily white. The judges were lily white. We can't have that anymore. This is modern America. This is modernity. This is America. This democratization. You're living behind the 8 ball of the past, Peter.
Next question.
Can I say one thing about that?
Well,
I believe, with all respect, I believe that you are living in the past. In 2017, every college is bending over backwards to find qualified black students and qualified black professors. There is no question that those applicants have an enormous advantage. We're not talking about 1950. We're talking about 2017.
Next question.
Thank you both for coming today. I really appreciate it. Michael, my question is mostly for you. So you made a comment earlier about racial thoughts like throughout this room or like in the general public, and how you thought the idea that individuals in American society aren't necessarily having aren't necessarily racist. So I guess my question to you is, do you think that opponents of affirmative action are inherently racist?
No.
He said no.
No. I mean, many of them are well-meaning. Many of them are misinformed. Many of them don't understand the history of discrimination and segregation in American society. Many of them don't understand how they themselves benefited from a pervasive, intensive system of segregation. Many of them don't even know about the FDA and the governmental agencies. When the government had FDA program and veterans programs, blacks weren't qualified. They weren't eligible for that. They couldn't get mortgages at Levittown. Levittown is primarily, as the last time I checked, less than 1% black. It's still white. And you know why? Because blacks weren't eligible. They weren't qualified for mortgages and the things they gave white people.
Okay, you answered the question. But next question. I think this is going to have to be a final question.
Just let me say, in 10 seconds, here I completely agree with what Michael just said, in the sense that Americans, unfortunately, are ignorant about our racial past. And his comments about FHA and other agencies, they're true. But that was a long time ago. And the legal regime and the moral regime has changed enormously since then. We're talking about affirmative action in 2017.
This is going to have to be our final question. Go ahead.
So since I love lunch meats, I'm going to bring us back to the bologna for a little bit. As far as students are at schools not to represent their race or to provide diversity training to other students but to succeed.
I hear.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
So as far as students are at schools not to represent their race or to provide diversity training to other students but to succeed, does it not seem inappropriate to base acceptance on race at all rather than predictors of academic success?
Quick answer from both of you to that question because we're running out of time.
Obviously my position.
That's Peter's position, and Michael, not your position?
Well, my position is that colleges and universities are not making decisions based on race. That race, and they can't. The Supreme Court has spoken on that. The issue of making sure that one's class is diverse, economically diverse, racially diverse, geographically diverse, all kinds of students for purpose of interaction and integration. That's what the colleges do. They don't admit people based on their race. That would not be proper.
Thank you, Michael. Okay, we're wrapping up now. Unfortunately, we don't have any more time for questions. You'll get a chance to talk to the speakers afterwards when we're partying it up. Peter, 5 minutes for your summary. Please take the podium and give us your summary.
Well, as I said at the outset, my purpose here, my argument here is to show that race-based affirmative action is a poor public policy. It is not wise for all the reasons I've suggested, and its social costs exceed its social benefits, and it really harms many, if not most, of the people who it purports to advantage. Let me make one point that hasn't been made that it seems to me is extremely important, and that has to do with self-segregation as a result of affirmative action on campus. There are a number of studies that show persistent racial self-isolation on campuses that give preferences, which also cast doubt on the interracial socialization idea. Orlando Patterson, a supporter of a complex structure of affirmative action, laments that he, quote, no group of people now seems more committed to segregation than Afro-American students and young professionals. Political scientist Jack Citrin found that the 250-point white-black gap in SAT scores at Berkeley created an academic caste system there in which the preferred students major in different and frankly easier subjects. Significantly, this ethnic academic gap among students narrowed once California banned preferences in 1996. Fortunately, I think there are alternatives to the existing unjust and pernicious system of preferences. The most important of these is a system of race-neutral preferences based on socioeconomic disadvantage. A number of people have given a lot of attention to this, and I will just mention a few of them. Richard Collenberg at the Century Foundation has done a lot of work on this and has come up with, I think, some excellent alternatives. In addition, Carolyn Hoxby, a black economist at Stanford, has done a study showing that a large group of high school students who are perfectly capable of performing well at selective colleges do not apply to those selective colleges, and do not apply at all to colleges in many cases, and that it would cost about $6 per student to induce them to apply. Both of those alternatives seem to me to be vastly preferable to racial preferences. A third approach is the percentage plans that several states have adopted. Texas has adopted one. I discussed that in my book, whereby the top X percent, often it's 10% of the high school class, is guaranteed admission to one of the state's schools. The point I've emphasized throughout is that affirmative action does not achieve what it's supposed to achieve, and in fact makes matters worse, except for relatively few students who are advantaged by the preferences, most of whom are upper middle class or immigrants from Africa. That was not the point of affirmative action. Those who proposed affirmative action in order to improve race relations and to improve the prospects for young black people as they enter society have been utterly dashed. And we should not continue with a policy that is so perverse and pernicious as this one is, and one that violates our basic commitments to non-discrimination and equal opportunity.
Thank you, Peter. Michael, 5 minutes for your summary.
Well, first, I want to thank this whole forum for the opportunity to debate this question. I want to thank Peter for debating it with me. As we're still on the Delhi example, self-segregation, baloney. Read our study, the New York Civil Rights Coalition study about self-segregation on the college campuses. You will find, as we found, that that segregation was funded by, arranged by, coordinated by, and promoted and fostered by the college officials who believe that their minority students are different and inferior, and they need special help. All of them, just because of their skin color. That's paternalism. That's not racial integration. That's racial separatism, which is funded by the colleges. We object to that. Now, my final point is that the guardians of the academy have got to show that they are up to the task of brilliance, of pursuing and achieving access and excellence. To fail to do so is for them a failure of the human intellect. There is nothing legally or morally wrong about pursuing racial integration, about assuring gender integration, of pursuing race-conscious recruitment and implementing sensible remedies to past and extensive racial exclusion and tokenism. Whites who regard themselves as innocent, who were permitted, or their parents and grandparents were permitted to buy housing which was off limits to blacks, benefited from ensuing decades of equity appreciation, wealth which helped finance college and their children, and was later bequeathed to them, according to one scholar. Black families prohibited by federal policy, governmental policy, from buying into these initially low-priced suburbs lost out, quote unquote. Now, government also contracted with unions that either kept blacks out of their ranks or restricted them to the lowest paying jobs. Finally, Ira Glasser, my other mentor, former executive director of the American Civil Liberties Union, points out that huge, and I quote, huge and persistent differentials in wealth and assets, as distinct from the narrowing differentials in income, provides a profound example of how past injuries have functioned as a kind of seniority system for equality. Layered on top of centuries of skin color discrimination and exclusion, seniority systems have the effect, if not the intention, of replicating and reifying inequality, of rewarding unjust beneficiaries and punishing victims of prior discrimination and exclusion. In effect, a regime of formal equality, now we want formal equality, layered on top of these structural inequalities, function as a seniority system for injustice, placing a veneer of fairness over a fundamentally unfair structure, unquote. That's the upshot of it, ladies and gentlemen. I don't accuse anybody here of racism. I want you to know the history that has brought us to this day and the discrimination that the effects of which we still grapple with today. I want racial integration, not separation. I want people to be regarded and treated as individuals, not as racial groups. We're talking about admission to college and professional schools. And when you have a situation of a past, centuries old, decades old, of exclusion based on race and tokenism based on race, I don't see any problem with the guardians of the academy saying, oh, we're brilliant. We are the best and the brightest, and we can devise programs of access and integration that are not paternalistic and that are fair and reasonable and legal. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. So that wraps it up. We want you to take out your smartphones and vote again on the resolution. All affirmative action programs in public colleges and universities that are based on ethnic, racial composition should be abolished. Please vote again, yes, no, are undecided on the resolution. And while you're thinking about it, I want to invite both of our worthy debaters to stick around for our party afterwards so that many of you who would like to can engage them in deeper conversation about these and related issues. I want to remind you that Peter Schuck will be selling books. Two of his books, one of them is touches upon this issue of affirmative action. That's called One Nation, Undivided, Undecided. Excuse me, Undecided. And the other book is called Why Government Fails So Often and How It Can Do Better. It got a rave review in Barron's, and that review was written by me. I said that ultimately, and I had not met Peter Schuck. He hadn't bribed me. I didn't know the guy. I just said about his book that ultimately this guy, who, by the way, who tells us he voted for Barack Obama both times, this guy who writes Why Government Fails So Often convincingly tells us how often it does fail. And when he writes How It Can Do Better, he convinces us in the end that it can do better by doing far less. It is, as I say, a great gateway drug for moderates to become libertarians. I recommend it highly. It's only $20 tonight. So I suggest you buy it along with Peter's other book. Who knows? Maybe he'll offer you a discount if you ask for both of them. Although probably you won't. Anyway, next month, we will have Don Boudreaux, who, by the way, I'm a huge fan of Don Boudreaux's daily missives on Cafe Hayek. I think they're delightful, always very sharp. Don, I know, is quite a celebrity in most areas, certainly in New York. I know we anticipate a pretty big crowd for Don Boudreaux defending the resolution. The U.S. government should unilaterally abolish. Unilaterally, no deals, no agreements, just do it. Unilaterally abolish all tariffs and duties on imports and all subsidies to exports. He will be opposing Rick Manning, president of Americans for Limited Government, on that issue. That's Don Boudreaux. So buy your tickets as soon as you can for that next event. We're nearing the end of the voting. Kate, do you want to close the voting? Does it look about right? Do you look like the all votes are in? Has everybody voted? Who already voted? Bear in mind that your vote is only counted. We have this program was developed for us by a brilliant programmer who's now working on the driverless car in California, and his name is Yuri Sobolev. And the program makes sure that the only way your vote is counted is if you voted both times. If you vote the second time, you didn't vote the first time, you're not counted. So it's a pure scientific vote of before and after. And Kate, looks like we're done. Bring me the results. Yeah. Okay, the initial vote, the yes votes initially got 58% and went up to 75%, so they picked up 16 percentage points. That was Peter's side. That was the thing to win. It turns out that the no vote lost 11 percentage points. Therefore, the Tootsie Roll goes to Peter Schuck. Congratulations.